Good morning, viewers. Welcome to today's newspaper review. Let's take a look at today's headlines. Firstly, we'll start from the Daily Trust newspaper. On the Daily Trust newspaper on page 5 and 6, which is boldly written, "Death at Umahi's home. Calls for investigation mount." At the top of the newspaper on page 10, Inec guidelines. Appeal court dashes hope of politicians and parties. To read more on that story, go to page 10 of the Daily Trust newspaper, and on page 3 of the newspaper, Phantom Council Director General held at former SARS headquarters. Phantom Council Director General held at former SARS headquarters. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper, and on page 7 of the newspaper, HIV malaria treatment may suffer as US moves to cut aid. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 5, Achimugo forfeits 4.6 billion naira jewelry and cars to federal government. To read more on that, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Guardian newspaper, and on the Guardian newspaper, in the big story page, which is boldly written, "Food security paradox. How hungry Nigerian loses 38 million tons to poor post-harvest plan." How hungry Nigerians has lost 38 million tons to poor post-harvest plan. To read more on that story, go to page 4 and 5 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, and on page 3, Gbajabiamila slams 15 billion naira suit on Adeyemi as group demands proof of PFIPC scandal. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. And still on page 3 of the newspaper on foreign news, which is written, US welcomes talks on country of concern designation as Garcia ends visit. Still in the same newspaper, NAS insists on autopsy demand probe of Habila's death. NAS and NAUS are insisting on autopsy demand to prove Habila's death. To read more on that story, go to page 29 of the Guardian newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, troops rescue Kogi NECO exam victims hours after adopters demand 10 million naira. This is a good news as troops has rescued the Kogi NECO examination and victims and other students that was also kidnapped during the week. To read more on that story, go to page 30 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph, and on the New Telegraph in page 3 and 6, which is boldly written, "Increasing violence, US reps pass bill withholding assistance to Nigeria." At the top of the newspaper, Cardoso, Nigeria's net external reserves surge above $40 billion. To read more on that story, go to page 3 and 8 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, 2027, safeguard democracy, rejects violence, vote buying. Abbas tells youth, this is coming from Abbas to youth, that they should safeguard democracy and reject violence and vote buying. To read more on that story, go to page 3 of the New Telegraph paper. Still on page 3 of the New Telegraph, federal government, Nigerian risk demographic crisis without urgent investment in genomics. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. And on page 2 of the newspaper, Iran targets military bases as US launches wave of strikes. Iran targets military bases as US launches wave of strike. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, court bars Federal Road Safety Corps officials from state roads. So the court has banned the Federal Road Safety Corps officials from state roads. To read more on that story, go to page 5 and 6 of the newspaper. And on page 4, 6, and 27 of the newspaper, which is boldly written, 2027, appeal court dismisses judgment nullifying INEC election guidelines. To read more on that, you go to page 4, 6, and 27 of the newspaper. And on page 2 and 28 of the newspaper, 2027, IGP orders nationwide civil disarmament, illegal arms mop up. To read more on that, you go to page 2 and 28 of the New Telegraph paper. Away from that newspaper to the Matrix newspaper. On the Matrix newspaper on page 2, which is boldly written on economic hardship, federal government unveils 4.2 trillion naira poverty relief, healthcare, education programs. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. And at the top of the newspaper, CBN unveils online FS portal, tightens rules for BDCs, threatens sanction. CBN unveils online FS portal, tightening rules for BDCs, threatens sanctions. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, principal, NECO official, students kidnapped in Kogi regain freedom. This kidnapping happened earlier this week. That was yesterday. So the victims that were being kidnapped in their examination hall have been rescued. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper, on page 25, on entertainment, Bella Shmurda, I lost $4 million to stolen property deal. This is coming from a popular Nigerian musician, says that he lost $4 million to stolen property deal. And on sports, on page 25, on sports, Arsenal consider surgery for Salimba's back injury, complete to Zoli's deal. To read more on that, you go to page 25 of the newspaper. And still at the bottom of the newspaper, court bars Federal Road Safety Corps from operating on states' local government roads. So the court have banned the Federal Road Safety from operating on states and local government roads. To read more on that story, go to page 2 of the Matrix newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. On the Daily Monitor newspaper, which is boldly written, Appeal Court validates Inec'S 2027 election guidelines. Appeal Court validates INEC 2027 election guidelines. At the top of the newspaper, Mary Habila's death. Umahi opens up, says, I'm deeply pained. This is coming from the Minister of Works in Nigeria. Umahi says that he's deeply pained concerning the death of Mary Habilas. Still in the same newspaper, courts to deliver judgments in Turaki-led PDP suits against INEC, others today. To read more on that, you go to page 4 as courts deliver judgments on Turaki-led PDP suits against INEC and others. And on page 5 of the paper, 2027, INEC must full systems audit, mock presidential election. INEC mock full system audit, mock presidential election. Still on page 5 of the newspaper, Obi prioritizes education, healthcare in second phase of new Nigeria. Obi, who is the former governor of Anambra State and the presidential candidate for the NDC, says that he prioritized education, healthcare in second phase of new Nigeria. To read more on that, you go to page 5 of the Daily Monitor paper. And the bottom of the newspaper, Tinubu unveils $3.05 billion anti-poverty human capital programs. President Tinubu unveils $3.05 billion anti-poverty human capital programs. Away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper. On the Punch newspaper on page 2, on autonomy battle, states defy Supreme Court, control 10 trillion naira local government allocations. States defy Supreme Court, control 10 trillion naira local government allocations. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the Punch newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 7, on 2027 election, INEC unveils mock presidential pool plan. To read more on that, you go to page 7 of the newspaper. And on page 9 of the newspaper, President Tinubu approves Lagos-Ibadan Expressway reconstruction. To read more on that, you go to page 9 of the newspaper. And on page 7 of the newspaper, still on Kogi rescue adopted principal, NECO officials, and 2 students. To read more on that story, go to page 7 of the newspaper. And on page 16 of the newspaper, nurses' deaths. Umahi, police fight bid to stop autopsy. To read more on that, you go to page 16 of the Punch newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the last newspaper, which is the Vanguard newspaper. And on the Vanguard newspaper, which is boldly written on page 5, PFIPC, Baja slams 15 billion naira suits against Adeyemi. Gbajabiamila slams 15 billion naira suits against Adeyemi. To read more on that, you go to page 5 of the newspaper. And on page 7 of the newspaper, US Congress cuts aid to Nigerian by 50% over Christian persecution. To read more on that, you go to page 7 of the Vanguard newspaper. And on page 10 of the same newspaper, on Oyo School rescue, what we went through in captivity, says rescued Orire students. To read more on that, you go to page 10 of the newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper on page 21, why Tinubu must overhaul football administration, says expert. This is coming from expert, says why President Tinubu must overhaul football administration. To read more on that, you go to page 21 of the newspaper. And on page 6 of the newspaper, still on kidnapped Kogi students that have been rescued. This is coming from the state government about the kidnapped Kogi students and NICO official that have been rescued. To read more on that, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. And on page 8 of the newspaper, which is written 2027, INEC to conduct mock presidential poll. And that's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Isum. Do have a beautiful day.